All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 3 for PPA 500. I told you this class goes by very quickly, and we're already in the third week. Next week will be our halfway point for the class, if you can believe that. So it does tend to go by quickly. I hope you're having a good week so far. I know that we progressed through some information very quickly last week because the first half of the class was with Kelly Janicek, and so we didn't have a whole lot of time left. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to go through the remainder of that information on the foundations of American government, look at the Constitution, and then in the last part of class tonight, we'll turn our attention to accountability and ethics in the public sector to get you ready for your next Canvas essay. But before we get to all of that, let me just say thank you very much for your initial skills self-assessments. I reviewed all those, and those have been returned with feedback, which feedback's basically just thank you for submitting because it was credit, no credit. And then also thank you for your first Canvas essay. I went through and read through all those and the responses and provided some feedback on those as well. I think everyone did a really nice job on the Canvas essay. They were insightful. The responses were complete. The responses to classmates I thought were professional and supportive. And so I'm very happy with the first Canvas essay. So my advice would just be keep on doing it. And so do the same type of thing for the second, third, fourth, and fifth Canvas essays, and everyone will be in good shape. So thank you very much for that. Your second Canvas essay is coming due on Monday, February the 13th. And for that one, we're looking at accountability and ethics, and you'll be taking 3 of the principles from the American Society for Public Administration Code of Ethics and discussing which of the 3 principles, and there are 8 principles, but which 3 of those 8 principles do you believe would be most difficult for either your organization or most difficult for you to try and implement on a daily basis? And in our second half of class tonight, we will talk about those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Ethics and introduce you to those so you'll be all ready for your second Canvas essay to turn in the next Monday. So that's where we are in terms of our assignments and how everything is looking. I did tell you in our first night of class that with our midterm assessment, that I will make that available at least 2 weeks before the due date. And so that means I will make that available, believe it or not, I'll make that available already next Monday. So I'll make that available on our Canvas site, and then you can start working on that at your leisure. Okay, are there any questions or anything at all before we get into our substantive information for the evening? Okay. I am teaching from home tonight, so I'm not on campus, and so hopefully my connection will be good, but I've got an Ethernet, so I'm hoping that it doesn't cut out on me. But for some reason I disappear, just hang in there. I'll reconnect as soon as I can, and the session will stay live and active until I get back in. So hopefully it won't be an issue, but just in case, just hang in there if I get disconnected. Okay, so in the second half of class last week, we did some of our foundational information in American government. And we cover things such as separation of powers, a little bit on federalism. We talked about our social contract, this constitution that we have, as really being predicated upon this idea of a limitation of power. We limit powers horizontally with separation of powers with our 3 branches of government, and we limit power vertically with our system of American federalism and the differences between national government responsibilities versus state government responsibilities. But a lot of our discussion last week was really based upon the notion of power. And so I thought we should take a few minutes at the start of class tonight and really try and wrap our arms around this notion of what we mean by power. Because if we're defining our system of government as being based upon a limitation of power, I think we really have to have a good working knowledge and understanding of what the term power really does mean. So just to get us started tonight, anyone want to give us a quick definition of what power means to them? What's the term power mean?
An influence over others.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. An influence over others. Whenever we exert power, we are influencing others. And we're usually utilizing some type of resources in order to influence someone to perhaps do something they otherwise would not do. Because if it's something they're going to do anyways, they're going to do it. And so they don't really need us to influence them. But if we're influencing someone to do something they otherwise would not do, we typically think of that as this term of power. For this class, what I like to do is I like to introduce you to a more layered definition. I think that's a really good definition. I think that's a definition that we use in our everyday lives of power. But I want to kind of give you a little bit more of a social sciencey, if that's a term, definition of power. And I like to reference an author. His name is John Gaventa, and I'll put his name in text chat. John Gaventa. And John Gaventa was essentially a sociologist, and he was very interested in power and the dynamics of exercising power from one person to another or one group to another. And so, as any good social scientist would do, Gaventa decided that he should do a case study and collect empirical data. So he decided that he would do a case study in rural Appalachia, and he went to a coal mining town in rural Appalachia because he thought, where else would you see such an imbalance in power than in a coal mining town, and the imbalance of power between the coal mine owners and the miners who are working in that coal mine. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to look at this power relationship between coal mine owners and coal mine workers, and he wanted to answer the question, how are the coal mine owners exerting power and influencing the coal mine workers to do something they otherwise would not do? And we had a lot of these coal mine towns several years ago, and especially in rural Appalachia and West Virginia and Kentucky and Virginia. And in these coal mine towns, just about every aspect of daily life was being coordinated and controlled by the coal mine owners. And so the coal mine owners, they owned the coal mine, and they dictated all of the parameters of work that was being done within those coal mines. So what Gaventa saw is he saw miners working long hours. And so miners are working 60, 70, 80 hours, 80-hour weeks. He saw miners working in very dangerous mine conditions. That if you know anything about coal mining, you know it's a dangerous business to be in because mines have this really nasty tendency to explode. That whenever you are mining, it releases gases. And then if there's any type of a spark, any type of ignition source, obviously it's going to mix with the gas, that's going to cause an explosion. And if you've ever taken a pickaxe, you've ever hit a pickaxe on a rock, you know that there are sparks that are created. So it's a dangerous condition to be working in. There was a practice in mining that's known as dusting. And so in order to keep the potential for explosion down, what you can do is you can dust the mines, and you literally dust the walls of the mine. And by dusting the walls of the mine, you can trap the gases and then reduce the risk of having some type of ignition. Well, dusting is a practice that had been around for a long time. It was a relatively simple practice, but it cost money. So obviously, to increase their profit margin, the coal mine owners didn't want to spend the money on dusting. So they were putting off these dusting operations year after year after year. And the less dusting that got done, the more dangerous the mine conditions became. So these coal mine workers were working in very dangerous conditions. The coal mine workers, for their daily wages, they did not get paid in money. They got paid in tokens. And those tokens could only be redeemed in the company store. There was one general store in town. That general store was owned by the coal mine company, and you could only redeem those coal mine tokens in that coal mine company's general store. So you can kind of see how the coal mine owners had the entire town kind of sewn up, and they were making money on all ends of the equation. And so the question that Gaventa wanted to ask is, why are these coal mine workers working in dangerous conditions, working very long hours, tolerating getting paid by tokens? Why were they allowing themselves to be subjugated in this way by the coal mine owners? His study helped him develop three different, what he called faces, or three different types of power. The first type of power that he saw and he defined, I like to use the term overt, that's my term, but it's kind of an overt power. It's an obvious exercise of power. So you think about, the example I always use when we were actually in person and not on Zoom is, if we're in the SPA building and you get a score back from me, you don't like the score you got, you come up behind me and you push me out the window of the third floor of the SPA building. I then tumble to my death or my maiming. You're exerting power over me. We both know what's going on. If I see you coming, I know you're the one pushing me out the window. You know you're the one pushing me out the window. It's very overt. It's very obvious. That's what Gaventa refers to as the least dangerous type of power. Now, it's kind of dangerous for the person falling out the window, but it's the least dangerous in theory because both parties know what's going on and who is exerting power over whom. That's overt power. The second face of power he refers to as mobilization of bias. Mobilization of bias is essentially agenda setting. And when you take your policy analysis class, you'll talk a lot about agenda setting theories and agenda setting models. That before we can make a policy, that issue must first get onto the decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. So on the decision-making agenda of a state legislature or the House of Representatives, if it never makes it onto the agenda, then nothing will ever be done about it. This type of agenda setting power is what he saw the coal mine owners using over the coal mine workers. All these potential pieces of legislation that would make mines safer, that would reduce the number of hours that mine workers could work, that would increase their pay. All those potential pieces of legislation never got onto the state legislature's agenda. And they didn't get on the state legislature's agenda because the coal mine owners were able, through political donations and influence and lobbying, were able to keep those issues off of the state legislature's agenda. Now, the problem with agenda setting and mobilization of bias is the coal miners didn't know the agenda setting was going on. They didn't know that the coal mine owners were keeping this legislation off of the agenda. All that the coal miners knew is that this legislation was never getting proposed and never getting discussed. No laws were ever being passed, but they didn't realize that it was because of all the exertion of power behind the scenes through agenda setting that was being done by the coal mine owners. So in Gaventa's mind, this second phase of power, agenda setting and mobilization of bias, is more dangerous because the entity that's having power exerted over them may not know what's going on. It may not know that that power is being exerted. But the third and the most dangerous face or type of power, according to Gaventa, is what I refer to as co-optation. With co-optation, what the coal mine owners were able to do is they were able to co-opt the opinions of the coal mine workers. They were able to convince the coal mine workers that working 80-hour weeks was actually in their best interest, that working in dangerous mine conditions was in their best interest, that getting paid with tokens was in their best interest. So they were able to replace the opinions of the coal mine workers with the opinions of the coal mine owners. They were able to co-opt those coal mine workers. That is the most dangerous type of power, according to Gaventa, because both parties, there's information asymmetry, as we like to refer to it. There's not equal information. There's not equal awareness on the part of both the coal mine owners as well as the coal mine workers. And when you've got that information asymmetry and one party doesn't understand or doesn't know what's happening, doesn't know their opinions are being co-opted, then they're going to be, no pun intended, powerless to fight back against that. And that's why it becomes the most dangerous face of power. Why do I like Gaventa here in this context, in this class? Because I think it shows us that power can be a nuanced term, and there can be different gradations and different types of power. So I think as we go through this class and we talk about the powers of the national versus state government, or powers of the executive versus the legislature versus the judiciary, I think it's important for us to realize that power is the ability to influence others, but there are different ways in which you can influence others depending on which face of power you are using. So I just kind of keep this typology, if you will, of different types of power in mind. because as we go through, not just tonight, but through future classes, we're going to keep returning to this idea of using resources to influence others. And we'll keep talking about power and just, keep an eye on, well, what type of power are we talking about? Is it agenda setting power? Is it true co-optation? Because those types of power oftentimes function a lot differently and really have different types of consequences. But power really, and the distribution and the limitation of power really is at the very heart of our system of government and our Constitution. Now, we said last week we can distribute power, we can separate power horizontally as well as vertically. And I think we all have a pretty good sense of the horizontal distribution of power. We know about checks and balances, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. We'll talk more about that as we go through the Constitution in a few minutes with Articles 1, 2, and 3. But I think the distribution of power we don't talk about nearly as much is this idea of the vertical distribution through our system that we know as federalism. So I think it would be really instructive for us tonight to spend a few minutes talking about federalism, what federalism is, and how federalism has changed over the years, how the distribution of power between national, state, and then eventually local governments, how that distribution has shifted. Because our system of federalism, this distribution of power among different levels of government, is a very dynamic concept. There's really an ebb and flow to American federalism. At certain points in time, the flow is towards state government power and state government rights. At other times, that state government power will ebb, and then the flow will be toward a centralization of power in Washington, D.C. at the national level. And there's a variety of reasons why we go through this ebb and flow throughout our dynamic history of American federalism. So I think it's important we talk about some of the reasons why federalism has changed over the past 200 plus years, and then what federalism looks like today and how that influences us as public administrators in the public sector. So when we read the Constitution, we see two governments that are mentioned. There's a national government that is mentioned, and with Congress and the president and the Supreme Court, and then there are the states. And the states have certain protections that are afforded to them in the Constitution, but they also have certain limitations that are placed upon them in terms of their power and their duties and responsibilities. But as we'll see when we look at the Constitution in a few minutes, there are conflicting provisions in the Constitution. In one part of the Constitution, Article 6, the Constitution says the national law, the national Constitution, that's the supreme law of the land, supreme over state government. But then in another part of the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, we see that all powers that are not explicitly given to the national government, given to Congress, are then reserved for the states or the people. So those two provisions tend to really work at loggerheads with each other. And so it takes interpretation. And the ultimate interpreter, if you will, of the Constitution over the years has obviously been the Supreme Court. And we're not going to go through all the Supreme Court cases, and because that would take us an entirely different class to do all that. But we will highlight some of the more important Supreme Court cases in terms of this distribution of power between national and state governments. But it's important for us to note that constitutional federalism is what the Constitution says about the relationship between the national and state governments. Local governments do not have a place in constitutional federalism because local governments are not spoken of in the Constitution. Once we start to include local governments in our discussion, we kind of make the transition from this term constitutional federalism to the term intergovernmental relations. And when we talk intergovernmental relations, then we're talking about the relationship between not only national and state, but local governments as well. There's a very famous rule from the 1900s called the Dillon's Rule from an Iowa judge named John Dillon. And John Dillon promulgated this rule, Dillon's Rule, that says local governments are creatures of the state, that the only powers that local governments have are given to them from state laws and state constitutions, that their powers do not come from the national Constitution. saying that local governments are creatures of the state, as we see in this Dillon's rule. Let me go ahead and put that in text chat. Dillon's rule. That has an important implication, because what that means is that if state governments can create local governments, state governments can then empower local governments. And the extent of that is that state governments can also, if they want to, destroy local governments. They can take local governments out of existence. And we have seen this happen on occasion, not only here in California, but in other states, where the state legislature has voted to remove the incorporation of a city and say this city is no longer an incorporated entity. It now will revert back to being an unincorporated part of the county. And we've seen discussions about that. For instance, with Vernon is one example, where the state legislature talked about taking Vernon's incorporation away from the city, because the city is primarily commercial, it's primarily industrial. It has a very low concentration of residents. And so therefore, there's been some discussion of taking the incorporation right away from Vernon, and then Vernon returning to being an unincorporated part of Los Angeles County. We've seen a similar discussion with Urupa Valley in recent years. So states can do that. They can take away the incorporation of a local government if they want. They create them, they empower them, and if they want, they can, in essence, get rid of those local governments or take their legal standing away. Now, the ability of the state to do that will be governed by the state constitution, but not by the federal constitution. It'll be governed by the state constitution. So let's look at how federalism has developed, and we've kind of moved from this system of constitutional federalism, the relationship between national and state governments, and how we have then transitioned more into the world of intergovernmental relations. And if you're interested in federalism or intergovernmental relations, we have one class in the program, PPA 535, Intergovernmental Relations. That course is only offered in the summers. It's an asynchronous online course. But if you're interested, it's something you can use as an elective towards your 39-unit degree requirement. I encourage you to think about that course if you like. It's a 6-week summer course, but it's only offered in the summers. So if you want to do that, you can take advantage of it in summer session number 1. That's my little advertisement for intergovernmental relations. So how has federalism developed over the past 200 years? Through the Supreme Court interpretations. Well, from the founding of the nation up until the Civil War, the era of federalism and the way in which federalism looked was referred to as being dual federalism, in that we had different spheres of influence between the national government and state governments. And what you'll see in that little picture on the screen there is you'll see different depictions of models of federalism. The one on the left is referred to as coordinate federalism, where the relationship between national and state governments is very much of an independent relationship, and state governments are seen as being autonomous governing bodies. So you've got those two spheres of influence. You've got the national sphere and you've got the state sphere, and then obviously local government is subsumed within the state. And those two spheres of influence are separate from each other. So you look at that diagram, you have a line going between national and state spheres of influence. They are separate from each other. National government has its responsibilities, state governments have their responsibilities, and kind of never the two shall meet. In dual federalism, though, the importance is that the state sphere of influence is actually bigger than the national sphere of influence. So as opposed to this picture you see on the left there, the coordinate federalism, the state sphere of influence would be bigger than the national sphere of influence in dual federalism from the founding of the nation up until the beginning of the Civil War. Now, we'll talk later on tonight about Federalist Paper number 39. And we'll talk about how Madison defended the Constitution as being both national as well as federal. But one of the arguments that Madison makes in Federalist number 39 is that the basis of our system of government was designed by the states. He said the basis of power resides with the states because you had sovereign states that came together to form this union. And Madison basically lays the seeds for what would happen later on with secession, in that if the states can come together and form the Union, then Southern states made the argument in the 1850s and in 1861 that if they formed the Union, they could then leave the Union. And they were sovereign entities that could then leave the Union if they wanted to. As we have this run up to the Civil War, we know that slavery is the primary issue and state governments that are holding on to their institution of slavery. And Southern states did not have much trust in Congress. Congress didn't have a whole lot of trust in Southern states. Southern states felt that Congress is dominated by the Northern non-slave states. A lot of members of Congress were very, to say the least, were very dubious of the system of slavery, and were starting to push for abolition and for admitting new states as non-slave as opposed to slave states. So how the Southern states tried to push back is they made the states' rights argument that we are sovereign entities, and as sovereign entities, we do not have to follow the laws that are passed by a Northern-dominated Congress. And so there were three strategies, and I'll put these in text, Jeff, but there are three strategies that Southern states used to exert their sovereignty or their presumed sovereignty. The one approach, the one tool that they used is what was known as interposition. In the text chat, interposition. What Southern states would do is if Congress passed a law that Southern states did not agree with, they would block the implementation of that law. They would say, we are going to use all the resources we have at our disposal to block the implementation of this federal law because we do not agree with it. So we will interpose our resources in order to try and stop implementation. When that didn't work, then they went to the next step. And the next tool that they used was what was called nullification. And in nullification, they would literally do just what it sounds like. They would declare a national law to be null and void. They say, we don't agree with this law, and so therefore we are going to call it null and void, and we are going to ignore it. We're not going to just try and block its implementation. We're just going to declare it null and void and completely ignore this national law. Well, obviously, when that didn't work, then they moved to their final step, which, as we all know, was secession. Then they will secede from the Union. And again, that was predicated upon this idea of states' rights theory, that they put the Union together, so therefore they could leave the Union. Once the Civil War is over, and the states' rights argument, at least in terms of the Southern states being able to leave the Union, that argument was dead. And so after the Civil War, we move from dual federalism into an era of federalism that came to be known as competitive federalism. Now, competitive federalism, just like with dual federalism, you had two separate, distinct spheres of influence, the national sphere and the state sphere of influence. The difference, though, is that the state sphere of influence began to shrink and the national sphere of influence became bigger. The national government started taking on some responsibilities that historically had been the domain of state governments. So you think about the national government doing things such as regulating interstate commerce. You create the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. They started regulating food safety. They started regulating drug safety. They started regulating workplace safety. They really started getting involved in the regulation of the economy, tools and jobs that used to be the responsibility of state governments. So as they continue to expand their role in regulating the national economy, the national sphere of influence grows and the state sphere of influence shrinks. It's still what we would consider to be a coordinate model because the two spheres are still separate from each other. It's just the national sphere has become more prominent than the state sphere of influence. And that runs from the end of the Civil War, 1865, up until the New Deal. We know that we had the stock market crash. After the stock market crash, we then went into the depths of the Great Depression. FDR comes into the White House, and FDR has his New Deal programs in which he tries to use them to help pull state and local governments out of the depths of the Great Depression. And this then transfers us from competitive federalism into a third era of federalism known as cooperative federalism. Sometimes it's known as fiscal federalism as well. It's sometimes called fiscal federalism because the relationship between national and state and now local governments is really dictated by money. And so FDR creates all these, what we call alphabet agencies, all these New Deal programs, and funds them to then try and help state and local governments pull themselves out of the Great Depression. So once we've got all these new programs and all these new agencies at the federal level, we now start to have an overlapping relationship between the different levels of government. And you can see that model of federalism there in the middle. You've got your Venn diagram here with your three different spheres of influence. And there are areas in those three different spheres of influence whereby we have an overlapping of national state function, overlapping of national local function, and clearly overlapping of state local function as well. And so all that overlapping of duties, overlapping of responsibilities requires cooperation between national, state, and local governments. So once we have moved then into this era of cooperative federalism, we have these grants that are flowing out of Washington, D.C. And so it's really very much a definition of the roles and responsibilities of governments through the lens of finances and through the lens of money. So see, cooperative federalism, that third era, tends to run from the New Deal up until 1964, 1965. And with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, you then have Lyndon Baines Johnson, who then comes into the White House. And Lyndon Johnson brings with him his own view of federalism. Johnson really believed in centralizing a lot of the decision-making within Washington, D.C. He thought that Washington, D.C. should make the decisions and then hand those decisions down to the state and local governments. So there were two main tools that Johnson used in order to get state and local governments to, for lack of a better term, the national government's bidding. Remember, Johnson had this very ambitious plan known as the Great Society and the War on Poverty. And so he wanted to try and reduce some of these disparities in wealth between upper income and lower income Americans. And so the way in which he would do it is he used what were called categorical grants. And we'll talk a lot more about categorical grants later on, but categorical grants are very specific grants of money, whereby the recipient can only use those grants for certain specific types of expenditures. There are a lot of reporting requirements, and those state and local governments are held accountable for how they are spending that money by the national government. By using these very specific categorical grants, what Johnson was able to do is he was able to control a lot of the decision-making at the state and local level to make sure that state and local governments were achieving the goals of the War on Poverty and the Great Society. Then a second tool that we saw Johnson use, the use of mandates. Mandates are orders. And so when the federal government orders a state or local government to take a certain type of action, that's referred to as a mandate. So the combination of these very specific categorical grants and these orders or these mandates allowed Johnson and the national government to get state and local governments to try and achieve those national objectives of the War on Poverty and the Great Society. It's called creative federalism, primarily because categorical grants and these certain types of mandates, there were different types of mandates used, but one of the mandates that was used, some direct order mandates where you literally directly order a government to take a certain type of action, preemptive mandates where the national government would literally preempt the decision-making authority of state and local governments in certain policy areas, crossover mandates whereby the national government would say, if you don't do what we want you to do in this policy area, we're going to take money away from you in this policy area. Very creative ways and very creative tools that the Johnson administration used to get the compliance of state and local governments in achieving national objectives. Hence why it's called creative federalism. But again, the model of federalism is that middle one you see on the screen there, overlapping model of federalism. There's a lot of negotiation, there's a lot of bargaining that goes on between the different levels of government, in this type of an overlapping model of federalism. Now, you'll notice those years there that are attached to creative federalism, they're very few. We're saying, 1964, 65. It took Johnson a year or two to really get going after the assassination of President Kennedy to really see creative federalism come to fruition. And then it ends when Johnson leaves office. In the election of 1968, Johnson decided he was not going to seek his party's nomination. And so therefore, Nixon then got elected in 1968, took office in January of 1969. And when Nixon comes into office, he brings with him a completely different view of federalism and the relationship between national, state, and local governments. Whereby Johnson believed in centralization of decision-making in Washington, D.C., Nixon believed that decisions should be made at the point at which is closest to citizens. So he would make the argument, who knows what's in the best interest of citizens than local governments? Local governments will know better than state governments, and state governments will know better than the national government. So essentially what Nixon did is Nixon brought with him this idea of new federalism. In new federalism, he began to turn a lot of these responsibilities back over to state and local governments. So the tools that he used to turn these duties back over to state and local governments, number one, he used decentralization. And by decentralization, Nixon was talking about decentralizing the decision-making process so that state and local governments had a seat at the decision-making table. That if it's something, an issue that directly affects a state or local government, that state or local government should be one of the central decision makers. So you decentralize the decision-making outside of Washington, D.C. The next tool is what was called devolution. So it's one thing to decentralize decision-making. It's another thing to provide the resources to allow that state or local government to carry out the decisions that they are making. When you provide the resources to carry out decisions you are making, you are engaging in what's called devolution, devolving the resources and the power from Washington, D.C. down to state and local governments. So give state and local governments the resources that they need to carry out the decisions they made through decentralization. And then the third D was deregulation. So deregulate, remove some of those very tough regulations from Washington, D.C. that Washington had been placing upon state and local governments, that Washington had been placing upon private industry. Remove those regulations to free up state and local governments in the private sector to be able to make their own decisions and serve their own constituencies. So through decentralization, devolution, and deregulation, Nixon basically takes Johnson's creative federalism and flips it on its head and basically says, really, the responsibility should lie with state and local governments rather than with the national government. We saw that in the Nixon administration, and then we saw that again, most notably in the Reagan administration. So when Reagan comes into the White House in January of 1981, he brings back this idea of Nixon's new federalism, decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. For Reagan, when he tried to implement this new federalism, the primary tool that he used were block grants. So whereas Johnson was using categorical grants, very specific grants of money with a lot of accountability requirements, now you have Reagan who's using block grants, much more general grants and aid. Grants that can be used for a variety of different programs, as long as all of those programs meet the goals of the overarching policy. So, give you an example. If you have federal policies such as education of at-risk youth, education of at-risk high school youth, a block grant would allow a local school district or a local city to decide how they want to educate at-risk youth. So as long as you were spending the money to educate at-risk youth, you could have midnight basketball programs. You could pay for after-school counseling. You could pay for computer literacy programs, job training programs, childcare programs. You could use that money for a variety of different purposes, as long as all those purposes contribute to the ultimate goal of trying to achieve the overarching goals of that policy of educating at-risk high school youth. So you can kind of see with the block grants how state and local governments got a whole lot more flexibility and really had a lot of decision-making power returned to them. What Reagan did is when he came into office, he took 187 categorical grant programs that were left over from the Johnson administration, and he consolidated them down into 12 block grant programs. The nice thing for state and local governments is those block grants gave them a lot more flexibility and discretion in how to spend the money. The downside, though, was that it took away some of the money that came along with that funding. So you get more flexibility, but you lose some of your funding. So it's kind of a bittersweet pill for a lot of state and local governments to try and swallow. That new federalism takes us through the Reagan, the Bush administration, up to the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration and in modern federalism today, the approach is much more what we refer to, or I like to refer to as contextual federalism, in that the proper balance of power between national, state, and local governments is really dependent upon the context of the issue itself. I'll give you a few examples of that. If you look back at the Clinton administration, for example, the Clinton administration signed on with Republicans in Congress for welfare reform in the mid-1990s, what was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996, long term for what came to be known as welfare reform. The purpose of welfare reform is to have states move people from the welfare rolls into gainful employment. The way in which it would be done is by using block grants. So instead of using the old categorical grants, assistance to families with dependent children, AFDC grants, those are replaced with new block grants known as temporary assistance to needy family, or TANF grants. Those TANF grants, temporary assistance to needy family grants, were block grants in nature, giving those state and local governments a lot more flexibility in how they spent the money. Looks and feels a whole lot like Nixon and Reagan's new federalism. That was for welfare, and that came from a Democratic president. But then on a different issue, we see that same Democratic president trying to centralize power within Washington, D.C. And on the issue of drunk driving and blood alcohol content levels, or otherwise known as BAC levels, the Clinton administration wanted to have a national blood alcohol content level of 0.08. At that time in the 1990s, different states had different levels. Some states were 0.08, some were 0.06, some were 0.12. It was really all over the board. Clinton administration wanted everyone to have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level in their state. The problem is the Constitution doesn't say anything about drunk driving or blood alcohol content levels. Obviously, that wasn't a thing when the Constitution was written. So there are no constitutional provisions for that. So what the Clinton administration did is they used what was called a crossover mandate in order to induce state governments to adopt the national standard of 0.08 blood alcohol content levels. They told states, if you do not reduce your blood alcohol content level to 0.08, we are going to take federal highway money away from you. We're going to penalize you unless you do what we want you to do with blood alcohol content levels. It was successful. And now every state has a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. It was something that has been centralized into the one standard that was being pushed by the national government. So that's just with one administration. With welfare, it was much more of a new federalism approach. With blood alcohol content levels and drunk driving, it was much more of a creative federalism, much more of a Lyndon Baines Johnson type of approach. And that's just not endemic to the Clinton administration. We could go through examples in the Bush administration as well. No Child Left Behind Act compared to a lot of the programs in which the Bush administration tried to turn responsibilities over to state and local governments. No Child Left Behind, centralizing national standards and holding state governments accountable to those standards. That's very much of a creative federalism type of approach. The vast majority of other policies tend to be much more new federalism, turning power over to state and local governments. And you can say the same thing about the Obama administration, the Trump administration. It's a very common thing, regardless of the affiliation of the president. So I think today our system of federalism is much more a contextual approach to federalism, where the proper balance of power between national, state, and local governments really depends upon the context of the issue that we are dealing with. And Jay is right, and there's a unfunded mandate. A lot of these mandates that came down from Washington, D.C. were unfunded or partially funded mandates. In the 1990s, state governments had some success at getting a piece of legislation passed called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. That Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was intended to try and curb some of these unfunded and partially funded mandates. It wasn't entirely successful, and we talk about a lot of the reasons in the intergovernmental relations class why it wasn't as successful as we had hoped it would be. But the way in which the piece of legislation was designed meant that it wouldn't take effect immediately. It wouldn't stop these mandates immediately. And it was all these other programs, all these policies that predated the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act were all grandfathered in. So they were completely untouched by the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. So even though state governments had some success in the 90s at pushing back on some of these unfunded mandates, still a lot of the mandates we get from the federal government handed down to states are unfunded or partially funded. And a lot of the mandates handed down from state to local governments are also unfunded and partially funded. State governments will complain all the time about getting partially funded mandates from the federal government, but it doesn't stop them from pushing out their own unfunded and partially funded mandates onto their local governments. And they can do that, again, going back to Gillen's rule, that local governments are creatures of the state. So just to get back to this inset box here on our slide in the three different models of federalism, we've already talked about coordinated federalism, which we saw in dual federalism and competitive federalism, cooperative federalism, which we see in the era of, which we see with the model of overlapping federalism. The one on the right we haven't talked about much, and that's inclusive federalism. With inclusive federalism, this is kind of a little more along the lines of Johnson and creative federalism. With the model of inclusive federalism, you can see that your three circles, local government is subsumed within the state circle, and state circle is subsumed within the national circle. In the inclusive model of federalism, local governments are dependent upon the state, and state governments are dependent upon the national government. It's a very top-down, hierarchical way of looking at the relationship between the three levels of government. The important thing here with an inclusive authority model of federalism is that if the state government wants to increase its power and make that middle circle bigger, it has to do so at the detriment of national government power. Likewise, if the national government wants to make its circle bigger, it would have to encroach upon the state sphere of influence. This is what's known in game theory as a zero-sum game, that one party wins and by definition, another party loses. And our system of federalism and our disputes between national, state, and local governments have oftentimes been characterized as very much of a zero-sum game. If we're going to have the state government having more power, it means that it's power coming away from the national government. If we want the national government to have power with this policy, it's going to take power away from state governments. Because when you're viewing this as inclusive authority model, you have a universe of power. And that universe of power and authority is finite. You can't go beyond that bigger circle. So any adjustments that go on in power must be in terms of adjustments of those circles within that finite universe of power. So I think, again, this inclusive authority, you saw some of that in the era of creative federalism. Where we are today in contextual federalism, as I said before, depends upon the issue. For some issues, administrations look at it as inclusive authority model. For other issues, they look at it as overlapping authority model. They rarely look at many issues from a coordinated authority model today. For the most part, we assume that there are going to be overlapping relationships between the different levels of government, kind of regardless of the policy area that we are dealing with. But again, this movement from dual to competitive to cooperative to creative to dual to contextual federalism, this has all been done primarily through interpretations of the Constitution. As we said, the ultimate arbiter of these debates between national, state, and local government power will be the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, throughout its over 200-year history, has handed down a lot of important decisions that have really changed the texture and the complexion of federalism, and continues to do so today. And I know we're kind of running long on this part of the class, so let me just quickly move ahead to the kind of so what question. I think I told you my favorite answer is it depends. My favorite question is so what? Okay, well, so what? So we spent the past week or so talking about separation of powers and federalism as the bedrocks of our system of American government. Well, so what? What does that mean for the field and the study of public administration? Well, one implication of that is that we serve many masters. As public administrators, we are held accountable to legislative bodies through the oversight function. We are held accountable to the chief executive, as a chief executive, whether it be the president or the governor, as head of the executive branch. We're also held accountable to the judiciary, in that judiciary courts can pass things called structural remedies, where they can require administrators to take certain types of actions. And so we have these many masters we serve horizontally through separation of powers. We have many masters we serve vertically as well, in that if we're working at the local level, we have to be accountable perhaps to the state level. The state level then has to be accountable to the national level. Over my time in the school district, a school district is a special purpose government. I used to preach this all the time when I was on the school board. A school district is a special purpose government. We typically have two different types of local governments. We have special purpose governments and we have general purpose governments. A special purpose government is something like a school district, a water district, that's a government that is engaged in one specific type of policy or activity. So for a school district, it's education. For a water district, it's water policy. Contrast that to a general purpose government, such as a city or a county. General purpose governments like cities and counties have the responsibility for a large number of different policy and program areas. If you're a special purpose government, like a school district, you are held accountable to the county. And so we had the County Office of Education, the County Committee on School District Organization. The county is then held accountable to the state and the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education. And so you have all these different masters that you are serving up the federalism layers of the federalist system. Those many masters means that we have a lot of conflicting direction that's handed to public administrators. So the direction that you may get from a city council may look different than the direction that you get from a state legislature. Also, having all these different entities that you are dealing with means that you have a complex network of cooperation and competition that you have to navigate as a public administrator. It's a very complex environment that we are dealing with. And you think about today, we not only have tens of thousands of local governments, but those local governments also are joining in with the private sector in public-private partnerships. They're joining with the nonprofit sector in public nonprofit partnerships. It's created a situation that's come to be known as governing networks. And so today, it's not just looking up the federalism system, it's really these governing networks of different types of local governments and nonprofit and private organizations and state agencies all working together on similar policies and similar programs. And so there's a lot of complexity that you have to navigate in the environment. It creates this unique environment for public administration. And a very famous public administration scholar, John Gauss, who you'll run into again and again in this program. John Gauss talked about the environment or the ecology of public administration. We operate within a very open system where we operate in concert and sometimes in conflict with a lot of different agencies, a lot of different individuals, a lot of different interest groups with political parties. It's a very complex environment and very unique environment for public administration. Next week, we're going to talk more about the unique and complex environment of the public sector and contrast it directly to the environment of the private sector to give us a rationale for why we study public administration and study it somewhat differently from how we study business and private administration. So separation of powers and federalism really means something for how we do public administration. And that's why I think it's important for us to kind of all have that same level playing field when it comes to our understanding of American government and what American government then means for the practice of public administration. But as public administrators, we know that we have a contract. We have this contract, we have this constitution that we need to abide by in order to make sure that we are not violating the constitutional rights of our citizens. And so it's important for us in this 500 class to make sure that we have a general understanding of what that contract is and what that contract says. But before we get into a discussion of the Constitution, I've been talking for a while now, so let me open up. Do you have any questions or any clarifications needed for any of this information we've covered in terms of the foundations of American government?
Would you consider the current state of our government as it is right now? What type of federalism are they trying to, because you hear people yelling about states' rights, states, and then certain groups of states, and then you see others. Is there a change going on now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the change now is the nature of polarization, I think, has certainly shifted. And I said this in response in the feedback boxes for some of the Canvas essays this past week. We do see when we're talking about factionalism, we're talking about are we more factionalized than we were in the past? I think what we are is we are very polarized, and there are a lot of reasons for polarization. One of the structural systemic reasons for polarization has been political gerrymandering. And so as we have politically gerrymandered all these congressional districts and politically gerrymandered state legislative districts, what we have done is we have created safe districts whereby if it's a Republican district, there's no way a Democrat can win in that district. If it's a Democratic district, there's no way a Republican can win in that district. And so when you are a representative from one of those safe districts, you don't worry about the general election. You worry about the primary. If you can get through the primary, then the general election is not going to be competitive. Well, in order to get through a primary, who votes in primaries? Typically, the more active party members, the people from oftentimes from more ideological extremes within the party, those are the folks who tend to participate more in primary elections. So you have to appeal to the more extremes in your party. And so we see Republicans appealing more to the conservative wing of their party, Democrats appealing more to the liberal wing of their party. And what that does is it then pulls the two parties to their opposite ideological poles. And once you do that, you hollow out that middle ground. And once that middle ground is hollowed out, good luck getting any agreement on any compromise legislation. And so I think when you ask, what type of federalism do we have? I think it's going to depend upon what party is in power in the White House, what party is in power in the majority of the House and the Senate, because typically, if it's Republican, then those positions are going to be more to the right than they normally would be. If it's Democrat, they can be more to the left than they normally would be. The old adage whenever you're running a campaign is that you run for the middle is what you do. And you run for the middle because you want to appeal to the broadest array of voters as possible. In a primary, you don't do that. You run for the extremes. And if the primary is all that matters, then in order to get reelected, that's what members of Congress and members of state legislatures are going to do. And so I think that's why we've had this hollowing out of the middle ground, that we don't really see the cooperation and negotiation that we used to see in the past. There's a really good, it's an old book, but it's a really good book in political science called Congress, the Electoral Connection. And it's by an author, let me put it in text chat, by an author by the name of David Mayhew. And Mayhew, in his book, Congress, the Electoral Connection, makes a pretty simplistic argument, but I think a very true argument. And that argument is that there is one primary overriding motivation for members of Congress, and that is to get reelected. That's their number one motivation. Well, how do they get reelected? Well, according to Mayhew, they engage in three different types of activity. They engage in what he calls advertising. They get their name out there. They want to build name recognition and name recall. Name recall is very important. Name recall is if you ask someone, who is your member of the House of Representatives, and they're able to say your name, you've got name recall. That's more important than name recognition. Name recognition is if you give a list of people, they can pick you out of a list. Name recall is the most important thing to have. And you get that through advertising. And yes, dialing for dollars, you've got to raise money in order to get your name out there and do that advertising. And that's why elections have become extremely expensive in recent years. So you advertise. You also engage in position taking. And that's the second thing that members of Congress do. They take very high profile positions on very non-controversial issues. It's a strategy known as minimax. Minimax is you minimize your costs while maximizing your benefits. So you take a very high profile position on a non-controversial issue, an issue that's not going to be controversial with your base. And then that gets you to win primary elections. But the third thing they do is they engage in credit claiming. They claim credit for things. I did this, I did that. And so the things that they are claiming credit for are going to be the things that will appeal to the ideological extremes. So if you're a Republican, it will appeal to the conservatives. If you're a Democrat, it will appeal to the more liberal base of the party. It's really interesting to see a piece of legislation when it gets introduced in Congress. It'll have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 co-sponsors. If it becomes very popular, it will then end up having hundreds of co-sponsors because everyone wants to claim credit for it in order to try and get reelected. So if the primary motivation of members of Congress is to get reelected, they are going to be rational, self-interested actors. And the behaviors they exhibit and the things that they do will be done in order to further their reelection prospects. And so if you further your reelection prospects by moving to the right or the left to win a primary, then that's exactly what you are going to do. And so I think when it comes to how they view national, state, local relationships, it's not as ideological as it was in the past. It's more issue-based. And so if saying states should have the power over this issue appeals to your base and helps you get reelected, then that's what you're going to do. And unfortunately, it sounds very cynical. But I think that even though that book by Mayhew was written back in 1970, I think it's equally as true today, is that members will do what they need to do in order to keep their jobs and to get reelected. That was a good question. Any other questions or observations about any of this information up to this point in time? If not, then let's go ahead and go through the Constitution. We're not going to pick apart every single section of the Constitution, but I think it's important that we go through and just talk about some of the major elements of the Constitution, because as we had said last week, as public administrators, we are held accountable for not violating the constitutional rights of people that we are dealing with, which means that we have to have somewhat of a working knowledge of those constitutional rights within the Constitution so that we have this qualified good faith immunity. The Constitution is a very well organized document. It is organized around 7 articles, and it's organized around 27 amendments. So we have 7 articles, we have 27 amendments. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch. And so we're going to see Article 1 deals with the legislature, Article 2 deals with the executive, and Article 3 deals with the Supreme Court, the judiciary. We know, as our discussion last week told us, that one of the big compromises at the Constitutional Convention was this great compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, of creating a bicameral legislature. So we have that bicameral legislature in Article 1, Section 1. We have a Senate and we have a House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 2 then talks specifically about the House of Representatives. Members of the House will serve 2-year terms. Members of the House have to be at least 25 years old in order to serve in the House. They must be at least a citizen of the United States for 7 years and be an inhabitant of the state in which they are chosen. So the requirements for being in the House are a lower standard than being in the Senate, which is a lower standard than being president of the United States. We know that the House of Representatives members are popularly elected, And we know that they are popularly elected for these 2-year terms. We know that the 3/5 compromise was gotten rid of with the 14th Amendment, so that's no longer part of the Constitution. We also know that when there is a vacancy, that the executive authority, otherwise known as the governor, gets to fill that vacancy, typically through an election. We also know that the House of Representatives constitutionally must select its own speaker. Now, the speaker is the only position in the House of Representatives that is found in the Constitution. And if you watch the speaker election from a few weeks ago, you know, went through 15 ballots before Kevin McCarthy was elected as speaker. But that's a process that the House must go through constitutionally to select its speaker. Section 3 then turns its attention to the Senate, and just very quickly, all the things we already know about the Senate. You serve a 6-year term in the Senate, so 3 times the term that you would serve in the House of Representatives. We also know you have to be at least 30 years old in order to be in the Senate. You have to be a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years, and you have to live in the state in which you are chosen. The Vice President of the United States serves as the President of the Senate, but only votes in the case of a tie. Now, we've seen that recently. And we've seen Kamala Harris go over and break a tie in the Senate. It happens on occasion. It's not a very frequent occurrence, but it happens more frequently when you have a very evenly split Senate like we had in the last term, and to a great degree in this term as well. In terms of the officers in the Senate, the one that's really spoken of outside the Vice President of the United States is the President Pro Tem of the Senate. The President Pro Tem of the Senate tends to be the longest serving member of the Senate from the majority party. Today would be Dianne Feinstein, but Dianne Feinstein turned the position down because it looks like she's not going to be running for re-election. And so Patty Murray from the state of Washington is the President Pro Tem of the Senate as the longest serving member. President Pro Tem of the Senate is important because when you look at presidential vacancy filling, you've got the president, you've got the vice president, you then have the Speaker of the House, and you then have the President Pro Tem of the Senate. The President Pro Tem of the Senate would be the next person after the Speaker of the House who then become president. Once you get past the President Pro Tem of the Senate, you then go through cabinet members. And it goes through in terms of the date at which that department was established. And you work through it that. Other important things here, the House is responsible, you know, back up in Section 2, the House is responsible for impeachments and passing articles of impeachment. The Senate then here in Section 3 is responsible for trying those impeachments. So we've seen this twice we saw it twice in the Trump administration where the House passed articles of impeachment. Those articles of impeachment are essentially an indictment. Then the trial is held in the Senate. And when the trial is held in the Senate, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court comes over and presides over that trial. And so it kind of involves the judiciary as well in that impeachment trial. When you do have impeachment trials, then the senators have to take an oath. And if you watch either of those 2 impeachments, you saw all the senators get up and raise their right hand and take the oath before the trial was held. So the Senate does the trials. And I know there's a lot here, but we're just going to hit the real high points. The House and the Senate also maintain journals. That's important because we have a congressional record. And sometimes if you watch C-SPAN, you'll see a member get up and say, I ask permission to revise and extend my remarks. That means that anything they didn't get to say on the floor, they would like to then put into the journal or into the congressional record. They get paid for their duty. That was changed somewhat with the 27th Amendment, but we will get to that in a second. Article 1, Section 7 is important. Article 1, Section 7 says that all revenue bills begin in the House of Representatives. The framers did that for a reason. They knew that people would be very interested in any bills that could raise taxation, and so they wanted those revenue bills to start in the House that was closer to the people, the House that was popularly elected. Remember in Article 1, Section 3, for the Senate, senators were not popularly elected. Senators were selected by state legislatures. That was a nod to the whole states' rights, the anti-federalists, and their influence that they tried to have at the Constitutional Convention. And so if it's a tax bill that people are going to be very interested in. You want to have it in the House where the members are popularly elected and where the members only serve 2-year terms, so they can be held accountable for any decisions they make about raising your taxes. Also in Section 7, we know that before a bill can go to the president, it must pass the House and the Senate in identical version. So it has to pass an identical version before it can go and be signed by the president. There are provisions for if the president vetoes a piece of legislation, it can be overridden by a 2/3 vote of both the House as well as the Senate. That sounds simple, but that is very, very difficult. Many presidents will go through their entire 4 or 8 years in office and never have one of their vetoes overridden. It's kind of unusual to have presidential veto overrides because it's tough to get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to agree to anything. Then comes Article 1, Section 8. This is one of the most important parts of the Constitution, because this is where we lay out the powers of the US Congress. Now, there are 2 aspects to Article 1, Section 8. The first aspect is that most of Article 1, Section 8 enumerates or lists the specific powers that belong to Congress. Whenever you enumerate powers, whenever you list powers, you are inherently limiting the power of Congress. Because the assumption here is if it's something that is not listed, then it's a power that does not belong to Congress. So by enumerating the powers, you are limiting the powers of Congress. So Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, the power to borrow money, the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states. That third one there is extremely important. That's what's known as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The Commerce Clause says that Congress has the ability to regulate commerce between the states. This power to regulate commerce, this power over interstate commerce regulation, is the grounds that Congress is used to increase its power. So whenever Congress tries to increase its power over states, it will oftentimes use this Commerce Clause in order to do so. Now, this is where the Supreme Court has stepped in. The Supreme Court has said, in cases such as the Brady Bill case, the Prince versus US case, that in order for Congress to use its Commerce Clause power, whatever it's telling states to do, it must have a direct connection to interstate commerce. If Congress cannot make a direct connection to interstate commerce, then it's beyond the power of Congress to tell states they must take that type of action. Establish uniform rule of naturalization, to coin money. Again, we talked about the different currencies we had going on during the Articles of Confederation. Well, here Congress has a sole power to coin money, provide punishment, counterfeiting securities, to establish post offices. And so we have a US Post Office, because Postal Service, because of Congress's enumerated power of establishing post offices. We have a National Science Foundation because Congress should promote the progress of science and the useful arts. Let's scroll this down a little bit. There we go. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. That sounds very innocuous, but that's huge. Because essentially what that means is any federal court below the Supreme Court is established by Congress. Congress had the opportunity, and did so in the Judiciary Act, to structure the entire federal judiciary below the Supreme Court. To declare war, only Congress may declare war. If the president wants war, the president must go before a joint session of Congress and declare war. Raise and support armies, provide and maintain a navy, go down, calling forth the militia. We'll talk more about militias when we get to amendments in a second. Jay, go ahead.
Question on the declaring war. How come since, I guess, World War II, they've gotten around that by calling what a military action versus a war?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, presidents can declare a military action. They can send troops into action overseas. They just cannot call it a war, because to call it a war, you have to go and ask Congress for a declaration of war.
And then the same funding occurs even though they're misnaming it?
Yeah, then you have to go before Congress to get an appropriation to fund that military action. And that's where Congress can decide whether or not it wants to provide that appropriation. So that's kind of the check and balance that Congress has. If Congress says, no, we're not going to appropriate the money for this, then it can't happen. But it usually does, because once the president puts troops overseas, it'd be a very bad practice for Congress to say, well, we're going to pull the funding away from those troops and leave them out there on their own. So chances are they're going to pay for those appropriations. Right. Yep. So, but it's a very important point that presidents can have military actions as long as it's not called a war. But actually called a war, you got to go before Congress. President did that in World War I, also did that in World War II. Just for trivia, if you're playing along at home, there is one member of Congress that voted against both World War I and World War II, and that was a member of Congress named Jeanette Rankin. And she was actually the only person who voted against a declaration of war for World War II. Again, we're going to talk a lot more about militia when we get to the Second Amendment, and so we'll hold off on that militia discussion for a second. If you go down to the bottom here of Article 1, Section 8, this is where you get to another very important part of the Constitution that Congress has used to greatly expand its power. And that's what's known as the elastic or the necessary and proper clause. The Congress should make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. In other words, in order to do all these enumerated powers, Congress can then make any law they need to, any law they consider necessary and proper to allow them to do all of these enumerated powers previously listed in Article 1, Section 8. So here's your conflict. Article 1, Section 8, up to this point in time, enumerated powers. It listed powers, which is a way to limit the powers of Congress. But then at the very end of Article 1, Section 8, you have this elastic clause that says you can do anything necessary and proper that you deem necessary and proper. That's a great expansion of congressional power. So in Article 1, Section 8, we limit congressional power, but then we have this passage at the end whereby we greatly expand the power of Congress. Whenever Congress has expanded its power, it's typically used this elastic clause, oftentimes in combination with the Commerce Clause. And those are the two parts of Article 1, Section 8 that Congress frequently uses whenever it wants to expand its power over state and local governments. Article 1, Section 9 then talks about some specific limitations on Congress. This first one was the compromise in terms of the slavery, non-slavery discussion at the Constitutional Convention, that it banned any law that would stop the slave trade until at least the year 1808, so it punted it to a future generation. The privilege of writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended. Habeas corpus literally means present the body, and so if you have someone who has been arrested, you can't just hide that person away. You have to say where that person is and what that person is being charged with. And so that writ of habeas corpus can only be suspended in cases of rebellion or invasion. Abraham Lincoln suspended writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War because, again, that was a case of rebellion. Congress may pass no bill of attainder or ex post facto law. A bill of attainder basically is if you say someone is guilty without a trial. So I say, you're guilty of doing this, you don't get the benefit of a trial, that's called a bill of attainder. You can't do that. Ex post facto law is an after the fact law. So you cannot pass a law that says that, well, when you did this last year, it was legal, but now we're going to make it illegal. So we're going to go back and we're going to prosecute you for doing it while it was legal. You can't do that. You can't have an after effect type of a law. Also, Congress was limited in the way in which it could impose taxation. Taxation had to be apportioned according to population under the original Constitution. Now, you may still have some people tell you today, when April 15th comes, you don't have to pay your federal income taxes because those taxes are direct taxes, they're not apportioned. That was true under the original Constitution. That is no longer true as a result of the 16th Amendment in 1913. So they say you don't have to pay your federal income taxes, do not believe them because the Constitution has been amended. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury. This is an important one, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Congress cannot just take money out of the Treasury and spend it. Congress, before it can take out money from the Treasury, must say what that money is being spent on. That's what the appropriation is considered to be. There are no titles of nobility, so you can't be a sir or a knight from Congress. If you want to become a sir or a knight, you have to go to England and have the queen or the king now make you a sir or a knight. Powers prohibited of the states. So here are some limitations for the states. No state shall enter into a treaty, alliance, or confederation. You can't enter into treaties. Only the national government can enter into treaties. States can't grant letters of marque and reprisal. A letter of marque or reprisal was when a nation would tell a person, you can go under the flag of our nation and raid other ships. Go out on the open seas and go raid a ship. We're going to allow you to do it and it'll be legal. That's what's considered a letter of marque or a letter of reprisal. You cannot coin money as a state. Only the national government can coin money and so on. No bill of attainder, no ex post facto law, and a lot of the same limitations applied to states that applied to Congress. And then there are limitations here about the ability of states to have duties on imports or exports. And you can read through all those on your own, but those are all limitations that the Constitution places directly upon state governments. Article 1 is the most detailed and the lengthiest article in the Constitution. It's not only the first one, but it's the most detailed. And so that will lead some political scientists to argue that the framers really envisioned Congress as being the first branch of government, since they were spoken of first, and there's more detail provided in the discussion of Congress in Article 1 than any of the other branches of government. Then in Article 2, we get into the executive branch. We talk about the president. The president serves 4-year terms. In order to qualify to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old, and you have to be a natural-born citizen. So it's not a 7-year or a 9-year citizenship required. You have to be a natural-born citizen in order to qualify as president. It also then sets up our electoral college, and we'll talk about the electoral college in a second, but sets up the electoral college for how presidents and vice presidents are selected. The whole idea behind the electoral college, there were 2 reasons. One reason for the electoral college is that the framers wanted to give some protection to smaller states. And they knew small states, because they have smaller populations, would be outvoted by the larger population states. And so by having an electoral college, you would then provide a little bit of protection for those smaller states in the selection of president. And then the second reason for the electoral college was an inherent distrust in the decision-making of average ordinary citizens. The framers were concerned about popular sentiment. They were concerned that the public would select the president who would not be up to the job and would not be qualified for the position. And so you have these electors who ostensibly are people who are more educated about politics, about governance, and they would then serve as a check on that popular sentiment. The way in which the electoral college works is, I'm sure most of you know, is today you have 538 electors in the electoral college. In order to win the presidency, you must win at least 270 electoral college votes. You have to get a majority of those 538. A state's representation in the electoral college is based upon its representation in Congress, in the House, +2. So your representation in the House and your representation in the Senate, since every state has 2 members of the Senate. California has the largest number of electoral votes. The smallest number of electoral votes would be 3 in states such as Montana that have 3 because they have 2 members of the Senate and they have 1 member of the House of Representatives. So the way in which electoral college works is that when you have a presidential election, then whomever wins the popular vote in that state, they have a slate of electors, and then in December, those slate of electors get together in the state capitol. They then cast their certificates for the person that the candidate they are bound to. All those certificates then get transmitted to Congress. In January, those certificates are then opened before a joint session of Congress, and then those results are read out. Again, you get a majority of the electoral college, you are then declared to be president. If no one gets a majority of the electoral college, then the decision gets pushed into the House of Representatives, and then the House of Representatives would choose the president. Each congressional delegation in the House gets 1 vote. So California delegation, even though it's huge, would get 1 vote, the same way as the Rhode Island delegation would end up getting 1 vote. The House selects the president, and then the Senate selects the vice president. Again, if there's no majority in the electoral college. And we've had some instances where we have election has ended and there has not been a majority of the electoral college, and Congress has had to make those selections. One of the most famous examples was back in 1824 with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Johnson. And in that election in 1824, it was really, you had multiple people running, and the top three candidates were Andrew Jackson, and you had John Quincy Adams, and you had Henry Clay. And what happened is Andrew Jackson got a plurality of electoral college votes, got a plurality of popular votes, but still didn't have a majority in the electoral college. So the election went into the House of Representatives, and that's what came to be known as the Krupp bargain. Because when it went into the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams offered Henry Clay a cabinet position to be Secretary of State if Henry Clay would get his supporters in the House to support John Quincy Adams. It worked. Clay's supporters supported John Quincy Adams. The House selected John Quincy Adams, even though he had less electoral votes and less popular votes than Andrew Jackson. And John Quincy Adams then became president in 1824. Called the Krupp bargain, because obviously those backroom types of deals. And sure enough, when John Quincy Adams became president, he then appointed Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. 4 years later, in 1828, Andrew Jackson came back and trounced John Quincy Adams and won a big majority in both the popular as well as the electoral vote. But at times we have had a situation where no one has gotten a majority in the electoral college. And so that's kind of how it works if you don't get a majority. The president has certain types of responsibilities that are placed upon him. But before we get to that, at the end of section 1, though, I'll just point this out. There is a specific oath that presidents must take whenever they are inaugurated into office. And it is right here in the Constitution. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I only point that out because in President Obama's inauguration, Chief Justice Roberts screwed up the oath at the inauguration. He got some words wrong. He had to start over. And so he insisted that the next day he come to the Oval Office and administer the oath again, because the oath is in the Constitution. He wanted to make sure he got the oath correct word for word, so no one could come back later and say, well, Barack Obama was not truly the president because he didn't say the oath that was listed in the Constitution. I just mentioned that just because it was an interesting situation where Roberts wanted to make sure that he got every single word correct because it's actually in the Constitution. And I'll speed up here. I know that we're running kind of long, but in section 2, we start talking about some of the duties of the president. The president is commander-in-chief, as you know. The president is chief executive in that the president may appoint members of the executive branch and seek their counsel and seek their advice. They can appoint people to the executive branch, obviously with the advice and the consent of the Senate. We also know that the president shall do a State of the Union address, which is occurring right now tonight. And I'm sorry that you're going to miss at least part of it because of this class, but from time to time, the president has a responsibility of updating the Congress and the nation on the State of the Union, which is what President Biden is doing tonight. The president does have veto power and can veto legislation and send it back to the House and to the Senate. The president has the ability to enter into treaties, again, with the advice and the consent of the Senate. Oops, I don't know how we jumped all the way down here. Let's go back. Yeah, PDF files are kind of a pain in Zoom. Oop, where are we at now? Okay. Okay, we did that. Going on down. And then there's impeachment. Again, in the past administration, we saw 2 impeachment trials that occurred with President Trump. Presidents, vice presidents, and civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors. The impeachment is done by the House, and the conviction, the trial would happen in the Senate. So it's treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The problem is that we discuss a lot what is meant by the framers when they say high crimes and misdemeanors. Some historians will say the word misdemeanors was put in there because they like the sound of it and it came from English law. They don't really mean misdemeanors. They just kind of like the sound of the word. But that's really been open to a lot of interpretation in recent impeachment trials. Article 3 then looks at the judicial branch and specifically the Supreme Court. The only court that's established is the Supreme Court. There are no requirements for being a Supreme Court justice. You don't have to be any certain type of age. You don't even have to be a lawyer or pass the bar. The Constitution is silent on those types of requirements. It sets up the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and that cases can get to the Supreme Court on two different bases. One is what's called original jurisdiction, which means if it is a constitutional issue that is of high priority, it can go directly to the US Supreme Court. That almost never happens. 99.9999% of cases that get to the Supreme Court get there through what's called appellate jurisdiction. They get appeal up through sometimes the state system, up into the federal system, through federal district courts, through federal courts of appeal, and then finally getting appealed up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court grants review, what they call granting writ, for a very small number of cases. The vast majority of cases, the Supreme Court refuses to hear. But the vast majority of cases get there through appeals. And then all the rest of the judicial branch was set up by Congress in the Judiciary Act. Article 4, Section 1 contains what's called the full faith and credit provision, which says that states must respect the state laws of other states. They must give full faith and credit to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. The full faith and credit provision. Section 3 talks about new states and how new states come into the Union. New states can only join the Union with the consent of Congress. Congress is the only body that can allow new states into the Union. So a few years ago, when California was talking about voting to separate itself into 3 different states, that would be all well and good, but if Congress didn't agree, it was not going to happen. Congress also has to approve any compacts between 2 or more states. And so any of these interstate compacts technically must be approved by Congress. And in Section 4, Congress guarantees, the United States guarantees to every state in the Union a Republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature of the executive against domestic violence. We're guaranteeing a Republican form of government, meaning that you will elect people to represent you. Why we are a democratic republic. Jay, go ahead.
Real quick on Section 3. So, you know, the taxation without representation, DC, Puerto Rico, Samoa, and all the others I'm unfortunately forgetting. How's that work, and why won't that ever happen?
It's completely up to Congress, and Congress gets to decide. Congress is talking right now about Puerto Rico and statehood for Puerto Rico. And every single session of Congress is a bill that's introduced into Congress to make Puerto Rico a state, and it doesn't go anywhere. But yeah, Congress can make that decision. If the people of Puerto Rico vote to become a state, then Congress will be able to authorize it and they can become a state.
So that taxation without representation sounds good, but is not fully applied, or what?
It sounds good, but it's not fully applied unless Congress wants to apply it. Exactly.
Thank
you. Okay, let's go down a little bit more. So we got the Republican form of government. Article 5 talks about how we amend the Constitution. Now, remember back with the Articles of Confederation, one of the main fatal flaws in the Articles is that they were next to impossible to amend because you had to have a unanimous vote of all 13 states to amend the Articles. So the framers know they had to fix that in the Constitution. So they fixed it by coming up with 4 different ways in which we can amend the Constitution. The first way is a proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. That's the only approach we've ever used. The first approach is the only one we have ever used. But there are 3 other ways to amend the Constitution. The second way is proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. So rather than having the legislature meet, you have a state constitutional convention and you ratify those amendments at that state constitutional convention. The third approach is 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. And then the fourth approach is 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then you can have the ratification by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. And the way in which the language is, it's and or, so you can mix and match. Jay, go ahead.
Quick question. I know we got time, so let me see if I'm on. Am I on? Yeah. So I read that there's 2/3 states, almost fully 2/3 right now for what you just said, a convention on the on what we're talking about. So could you just give 2 lines on that? That they're almost at 34 or whatever it has to be.
Yeah, we have a large, almost 2/3. We're not quite there, a couple states short, but we're almost at 2/3 for a national constitutional convention. And see, what would happen at that national constitutional convention is it could happen in a couple of different ways. One way is you could have amendments that are presented at that constitutional convention, or you have a constitutional convention that's called a runaway convention, where you end up replacing the Constitution completely with a brand new Constitution.
Correct.
That's the concern. Yeah, and that's why we've never actually done that approach. We've never had a national constitutional convention after our original constitutional convention because of the concern for a runaway convention. That once you get there, the same thing happens that happened at the last constitutional convention, where we were just going to amend the articles, but the ball started rolling, we ended up replacing them with the new Constitution.
Because I heard we're like 2 to 3 states away from that, and no one talks about it. It's not on the news. It's not in the media too much. And if you pay attention, it's kind of scary because they can throw out the whole thing.
They could, yeah. Yeah, if they petition, 2/3 of the states get together and petition Congress, then yes, we can have a national constitutional convention, and we can end up with a brand new constitution and a different system of government. Yeah, democracy is fragile. It really is very fragile. We like to think of it as being something that's going to be with us forever, but it may not. It's something we have to cultivate on a daily basis. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a participation sport. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep, you got it. If we sit by and we're not attentive, these things can happen. And it's happened to other countries before us. So it's important to have what we call external efficacy, the feeling that participating actually makes a difference. Because the higher our levels of external efficacy, the more likely we are to participate and be involved in our own governance. Then Article 6, obviously the big part of Article 6 here is the supremacy clause. And that's that second paragraph there. The Constitution, the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. In other words, the laws of the Constitution, the treaties of the United States are supreme above and beyond state constitutions and state laws. That's a very strong pronouncement of national government authority. Now, that is countered, obviously, with the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights that we'll talk about in a moment. So this was one of the concerns that anti-federalists had, is that this strong pronouncement of national government power would make the national government far superior to state governments and would erode state sovereignty and states' rights. And so that's why we had to kind of back off on that immediately with the 10th Amendment and the Bill of Rights. Ratification, the Constitution should be ratified according to Article 7. Once 9 out of 13 states ratify it, it would then go into effect. But as we discussed last week, we had 10 states ratify it within 2 years. The problem was the state of New York had not ratified it yet. The framers knew they had to get the state of New York. And so that's why we ended up with the Bill of Rights. That's why we ended up with the Federalist Papers written by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison. Now, this Constitution is really, as we said before, a series of compromises. It is both, according to Madison, both a national document as well as what he calls a federal document. And if you had a chance to read Federalist Paper number 39, you kind of see how Madison framed his argument. Remember, Madison in Federalist 39 was trying to convince the citizens of New York that not to fear this Constitution. This Constitution would not create too strong of a national government. So the way Madison did it is he basically made two arguments. One argument he made is don't be afraid of this Constitution because it is not unlike your state constitutions. If you look at your state constitutions, the 4-year term for a president is very similar to the 4-year term that governors have in current state constitutions. A 6-year term for members of the Senate at the national level is not terribly unlike what you have in terms of terms for your state legislatures. There's a lot of similarity, Madison says, between this Constitution and what you are used to in your state with your state constitutions. So that's one argument he made. Don't be afraid of it because it's a lot like what you already have. The second argument, though, I think is the more interesting one. And that's the one wherein Madison makes the argument that let's deconstruct the Constitution into its component elements and ask the question, is the Constitution national or is it federal? By national, he means a strong national government where the national government is predominant. Or when he says federal, he means more of a confederation, more of an association of states, whereby the states retain their sovereignty. So what he does is he takes all the different elements of the Constitution and compares them on whether they are national or whether they are federal. You then draw a conclusion about the Constitution as a whole. So to give it, we won't go through all Federalist number 39, but give you an example. He says, okay, the basis of power, where this Constitution, where this union comes from. This union comes from the states. The states ratified the Constitution. The states sent delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So the states created this union. So therefore, the creation of the Constitution, the creation of the union was federal in nature. It was done by the state governments. Again, that lays the seed for later secession when we get to the Civil War. But at that point in time, there was an argument to try and get the citizens of New York to buy into this new Constitution. So from that perspective, it's very much federal in nature. Let's look at the extent of power and who has the power. Well, when you look at how presidents are elected through this electoral college, which then gives states their votes within the electoral college, and it protects state sovereignty. It's not just a popular vote, it's done through the electoral college. So it's a federal type of element there. Granted, the House of Representatives is by popular vote, so that's kind of national, he'll give you that. But Senate is selected by state legislatures. That's federal. That gives the state the power to select the representatives for the Senate. So on whole, it's kind of national and federal, but it really kind of trends more to federal in terms of who has the power, the extent of the power. Let's take a look at how we amend the Constitution. Well, we amend the Constitution, it's got to be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures or 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. It does get proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate. So again, it's kind of a combination of the two, national and federal. So let's look at the operation of government and who's going to be running the daily operations of the national government. Here he kind of throws his hands up and says, okay, you win, it's national. It's going to be run by individuals, individual administrators, individual bureaucrats. And so that's more national in nature, that the states really don't have a whole lot of say in how the national government's going to be running on a daily basis. So that's kind of national in nature. But he says, when you add all of it up, the Constitution is a combination of both a federal as well as a national approach. And so you should not fear this Constitution because it's an amalgam of both approaches. It's a good compromise of the national as well as the federal, the protection of states' rights. And so I think Madison, even though he was giving a sales pitch to the citizens of New York, I think Madison comes to the right conclusion in that, yes, it is a compromise. It's a compromise of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, of the national approach and the federal approach that protects states' rights. But to really convince the citizens of New York, we had to immediately amend the Constitution 10 times with the Bill of Rights to reassure them that this new Constitution would not be too national in nature and would not establish too strong of a national government. So let's run through the amendments very quickly. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment, freedom of religion, press, expression, assembly. In terms of religion, there are two different clauses here. There's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion. The national government cannot tell you what to believe. Your belief is completely unfettered. They cannot tell you what religion to believe in. Also, Congress shall not prohibit the free exercise thereof. Now, over the years, the interpretation by the Supreme Court has placed some limitations on the free exercise of religion. If the free exercise of religion places public safety at risk or impedes upon someone else's rights, the Supreme Court has allowed some limitations to the free exercise of religion. And if your religion calls for sacrificing an animal, you can't go out in the middle of the street and you can't do that because that is a threat to public safety. So there can be some limitations on free exercise, but there really aren't any reasons for limitations on your ability to believe what you want to believe. Similar thing with freedom of speech. We know that freedom of speech is not completely unfettered. The Supreme Court has adopted some limitations to freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater because, again, it places public safety at risk. Same type of thing with the press. We typically don't have what we call prior restraint, in that we typically can't stop the publication of certain things in the press, but there are some limitations in terms of national security. Hey, Jay, go ahead.
No, isn't the Bill of Rights very unique? Do many other countries even have such an item? Like England doesn't, right? So
yeah, it is unique to the United States. Yeah, and it was done primarily to get the New York to ratify the Constitution. Okay. So yes, it is a unique type of document. It is unique to amend your Constitution 10 times immediately. I mean, most constitutions don't go through that process, but we did. Exactly. Peaceably assemble, again, courts have said you can have some limitations on assembly. You can, if it puts the public safety at risk. We know that whenever we have these, every 4 years, we have these nominating conventions that political parties have. They will have a prescribed place for demonstrators. And oftentimes it's within a fence and it's far away from the entry into the convention center where all the delegates are going. That's been permitted for the purposes of public safety. So there can be some limitations, but we do have freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. And then the one we argue about a lot today, Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I know last week, Jay, you had mentioned if you had a observation on that.
Yeah, one quick question. So someone told me that this was made, the amendment to Second Amendment was made so Virginia would sign the Declaration of Independence to allow, because they needed their slave patrols to cross state borders armed to collect slaves that had escaped. Is that true?
Partially, yes. I mean, that was a quote unquote benefit for the state of Virginia in order to get escaped slaves and be able to recover escaped slaves.
For their signature.
Right. Yes. I think that was part of the reason for Virginia. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, because everyone always, focuses on the militia and whatever and the other parts of this, which I'm not going to even discuss, but that, I think back then they had armories and they had their guns were in the armories. They weren't at home and so on. So there's a lot going on here that people seem to just ignore and talk about, I want my gun, which I get, but there's a history of why this even exists. Mm-hmm. And no one talks about it.
Right. And the militia part is an important part, the well-regulated militia. And oftentimes we throw that out, the well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. We completely forget that first part and go right to the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But there is a way, and there's a big argument about what do the framers mean? Did they really mean militia? Did they really mean to include that? One of the ways to find out what the framers meant is to see what they actually wrote outside the Constitution. And I mean, this is not the only thing that they wrote. It's not the only thing Madison wrote. There are other things that they wrote as well. And the Federalist Papers give us some really good insight into what the framers meant by a lot of the things that they wrote. And if you're interested in the Second Amendment and this whole idea of a well-regulated militia, there are two Federalist Papers that were written by Alexander Hamilton, number 46 and number 29. And in Federalist Paper 46 and 29, Hamilton speaks specifically about a well-regulated militia and what he means by a well-regulated militia and how he defines that term. And we don't have time to go into it all, but he basically says that it's not practical to take a citizen and turn them into a soldier. He basically says, even if we drill these militias, these citizens are never going to be like a well-trained soldier. It's not going to happen. That's going to take years and years of training and years of practice. And, Hamilton was a soldier. And so obviously kind of, look down on members of militias as they're not like us. They're not soldiers. But he did say that in order to be well regulated, these militias should meet and organize at least once or twice a year. And he said that, I believe it was in Federalist number 29, I believe he said that, which is interesting because if the well-regulated militia part of the Second Amendment is something that was kind of an afterthought, the question is, why did Hamilton then devote two Federalist Papers to talking about the well-regulated militia and what he meant and how he defined a well-regulated militia? And if he's advising that state militias should have organizing meetings once or twice per year, those organizing meetings were also to make sure they had the proper armaments, that they were ready in case they'd be called into action. Obviously, he wanted a well-regulated militia, and there is a connection here with the well-regulated militia prelude to the Second Amendment. And so I would, if you're interested in it, I would advise you go read Federalist 46, go read Federalist 29, and see what Hamilton really had to say about this idea of a well-regulated militia. I'll leave it at there and let you read it on your own.
Yeah, one more thing. So I think it's important to know that this was written to get the signature of one of the largest states, Virginia, to join. And that's why also Virginia had like 5 of the 6 or so first presidents. Yeah. Something like that.
Virginia turned out a lot of presidents because you certainly had Washington, you had Jefferson, you had Madison, you had Monroe. Absolutely.
So it's a club, and people have to talk about all these parts. It's important because no one wants to, because it's details and minutia, and I think it's important to understand at least. And I'll read these too, and others too. I find it interesting, and I'm sorry to say this, but I think other people are interested too.
Mm-hmm. No, I think right. It's important to know the context in which this was all written. I think again, that context you find by reading the other writings of the framers, and they're pretty clear about what they mean about some of these things. And I just think sometimes when we have arguments about these amendments, we don't really take the time, as you said, to go back and look at the context and read actually what they had to say in the other Federalist Papers. But yeah, go take a look at 29 and 46, and you'll see Hamilton really devotes a lot of attention to this whole idea of what is a well-regulated militia. So it wasn't just a passing comment that they just put in there. I mean, he really had intent of what he meant by well-regulated. The Third Amendment, we don't talk about a whole lot, quartering of soldiers, but it has to do with the right of privacy, that no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner prescribed by law. Again, that's a right of privacy to your home. The other right of privacy is on protection against unwarrantable search and seizure. You have to have probable cause, and this is why you have to get a search warrant in order to search someone's home or possessions. Fifth Amendment, war criminal justice types of protections against double jeopardy. And double jeopardy is being tried for the same crime twice. Now, one really important thing to note is some of these protections, such as double jeopardy in the Fifth Amendment, were originally considered to be only applying to the national government. So this did not apply to state governments, according to the Constitution. It didn't apply to state governments until it was incorporated to include state governments with a series of Supreme Court cases later on, as well as the 14th Amendment. So in this example of double jeopardy, and again, I know we're running long, but it's important to give you some examples of these things. With double jeopardy, there was a case in 1937 with a gentleman by the name of Palko, and it's Palko, and a case called Palko versus Connecticut. Mr. Palco was being tried for murder, and the jury found him not guilty. And despite being found not guilty, the state of Connecticut decided they wanted to retry him. So they tried him again, the exact same case, the exact same evidence, the exact same facts of the case. So he was being tried twice for the same crime. He was found guilty the second time and was sentenced to death. Palco complains and say, wait a second, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says you cannot try me for the same crime twice. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we're sorry, Mr. Palco, but the Fifth Amendment protection only applies to actions by the national government. You were tried twice by the state of Connecticut. State of Connecticut is not bound by the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Over 30 years later, in a follow-up case, Benton versus Maryland, the Supreme Court overturned their decision in Palco versus Connecticut and said, yes, indeed, the Fifth Amendment should apply to protections against state government action as well. Obviously, it was decades too late for Mr. Palco, but finally we get the incorporation of the Fifth Amendment to include limits on state government action. So it's taken some time for these protections to be applied to state governments as well. You don't have to be a witness against yourself. You don't have to self-incriminate. You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Again, no bills of attainder. You have to have a trial before you can be deprived of life, liberty, or property. Sixth Amendment, continue with some of your criminal justice protections. Excuse me. You have a right to a speedy trial. Now, sometimes this is questionable. We see people who will have to waive their right to a speedy trial if they don't want to be tried right away. But sometimes people will sit in jail for a year or 2 years waiting for a trial. We have an overloaded criminal justice system. But in theory, constitutionally, you have the right to a speedy trial. You have the right to confront any witnesses that are brought against you. Again, you're some more of your criminal justice protections. The Seventh Amendment, you have the right to a jury trial in civil cases that are worth more than $20. Now, back in the 1790s, $20 was a lot of money. Today, it's not nearly as much, but you do have a right to a jury trial in cases, civil cases of more than $20. Eighth Amendment, we argue about a lot, cruel and unusual punishment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. We have a series of Supreme Court cases challenging capital punishment as being cruel and unusual. One of the most famous, Gregg versus Georgia. But for the most part, the Supreme Court has overall allowed capital punishment to occur if states do want to pursue that type of punishment. Amendment 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Meaning that by giving these rights in the Constitution, we're not taking rights away from the people. That people are going to retain their rights. This is social contract theory. People keep their rights, they keep their freedoms. Just by listing all these rights and all these powers in the Constitution does not take rights and power away from people. And then your very famous 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or the people. Again, it's this 10th Amendment that was placed in there to alleviate some of the concerns of the anti-federalists and to allow them to see that states would retain at least some element of their own sovereignty and the national government would not become too strong and would take away the rights of state governments. That is in contrast to obviously the Supremacy Clause that we had read earlier in Article 6. And then just quickly go through the rest of them. The 11th Amendment limits the judicial power of the United States in terms of in cases that are brought by citizens of one state against citizens of another state. The 12th Amendment comes directly from Thomas Jefferson and his hatred of Aaron Burr, that originally presidents, if you got the most votes in the Electoral College, you became president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. That created a system where you oftentimes had a president and vice president from two different political parties. Thomas Jefferson loathed Aaron Burr. He was his vice president, and so he decided to get Congress to propose this amendment to have presidents and vice presidents essentially running together, so you would not have a president and vice president from different parties. We all know our 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment is your equal protection amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to it any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So this is your equal protection. This is the incorporation of a lot of these rights in the Bill of Rights to include protections against state government action as well. Interestingly enough, in the presidential election of 2000, with George W. Bush and Al Gore, this was the provision of the 14th Amendment that the Supreme Court used to shut down the recount in the state of Florida. And I don't know if you remember it or if it's a little bit before your time, but I was actually living in Florida in 2000. I was teaching at a university in Florida. So I kind of lived through all of this in the state of Florida. In the state of Florida, you had a vote difference when the vote count was stopped of, I believe it was 527 votes, that George Bush was ahead of Al Gore by 527 votes. If George Bush won the state of Florida, that was enough electoral votes to put him over the 270 by one vote. Obviously, if Al Gore won the state of Florida, that would give him a majority and he would have become president. The problem in Florida is that you had a lot of ballot discrepancies in that you had ballots where you were punching through the ballot. And so you would have spaces where you would vote for each candidate. Well, sometimes voters didn't push all the way through to break through the ballot. And so they would dimple the ballot, or they had dimple chads, and they had what they call pregnant chads, and they had dangling chads. And so what they had to do is go back and look at all these ballots that had not been completely punched through, and they had to determine the intent of the voter. So if they saw it was partially punched through, well, then that voter intended to vote for this person, so we'll count this vote for this candidate. And so each county had a different standard that they were using for determining which votes would count and which votes would not count. You know, what was an intent of a voter, what was not an intent of a voter. And so since every county had a different policy that they were using in the recount, during the Bush campaign took the case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court shut down the count, saying that because of equal protection, since each county had a different approach they were using, voters in each county were not getting equal protection. Their votes were not being counted equally. And so therefore the Supreme Court stopped the vote count, the recount, at 527 vote difference between Bush and Gore. Gore had been catching up. Every day he was catching up more and more, and he had reduced from several thousand vote difference down to 527. Likely, if the Supreme Court would not have shut down the recount, it's likely that if it would have continued, Gore probably would have overtaken Bush, but the Supreme Court shut it down on the basis of a violation of equal protection, and Gore then conceded the election, and George W. Bush then became president. So not too long ago, this equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment actually decided our president back in 2000. A long-winded explanation, but it's a good example of how it actually matters. Hey, go ahead, Jay.
Can I add to that? Being of someone who remembers that dearly, who was the governor of Florida at that time, which was Bush's brother. Yeah, Jeb Bush was his brother. Therefore, and then I feel that the Supreme Court selected Bush to be president because I think it went with their leanings at the time. Maybe I'm wrong. And then that led to the Afghan war, the Iraq war, that led to all these things. And therefore, we had Bush as president, but Cheney acting as president. So
yeah, it was really interesting on election night. All the major networks called Florida for Gore, and they said Gore wanted. They called the presidency for Gore. He had enough electoral college votes, and they called it for Gore. And when they called Florida for Gore, the networks then went to George Bush, who was watching it, and George Bush said, I know that that's not true. I have information from Florida that I actually won Florida. And the information was coming from his brother, Jeb, who was the governor of Florida at that time. And so, yeah, it was a very uncomfortable situation, I think, for Americans in the election in 2000.
And just one more thing, it changed the whole history of the 21st century.
It did. Yeah, elections matter. Elections have consequences.
So vote, everybody, please.
Yeah, I would assume policy would have been a lot different if the vote would not have been shut down by the Supreme Court. But it's just a good example of the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution and having some profound implications for policy because of the way in which they interpreted the Constitution. This 14th Amendment has also come under focus lately because of Section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector, president, or vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or officer of the United States or a member of any state legislature, or as the executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same. And there are some members of Congress who want to expel other members of Congress because they supported January 6th. And so this is something that is being used in order to, again, try and expel some members of Congress because of their quote unquote support for January 6th. So keep an eye on that. That's just, again, a more topical application of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. 15th Amendment, you cannot deny the right to vote based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment gave us our income tax, direct income tax on individual incomes. Again, under the original Constitution, all taxes had to be apportioned according to population, so that larger states would have to pay more in taxes than smaller states. The direct individual income tax is sanctioned by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment, meaning that anything Congress wants to tax, Congress can tax, thus giving us the direct federal income tax. So yes, unfortunately, you do have to pay federal income taxes. 17th Amendment gives us popular election of US senators, so no longer being selected by state representatives. 18th Amendment was prohibition. 19th Amendment was women's suffrage. 20th Amendment changed the terms of the president and Congress. In the past, presidents would be inaugurated in March, and so you had a big lapse from November, the election, until March, when the president would begin office. This moved presidential terms and congressional terms up to beginning in January to try and make it closer to the end of the election. 21st Amendment repeals prohibition. 22nd Amendment gives us a 2-term limitation for president. Again, the impetus for this was FDR and FDR's 4 elections to the presidency. 23rd Amendment gives the District of Columbia 3 electoral college votes, hence the reason why we have 538 votes in the electoral college. You have 435 to represent 435 seats in the House, 1 plus 100 to represent 100 seats in the Senate. That gives you 535. Plus 3 for the District of Columbia for 538. 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes, makes those unconstitutional. Again, poll taxes were being used to deny people the right to vote, especially with Jim Crow laws in southern states, and those were eliminated with the 24th Amendment. 25th Amendment came into view again at the end of the last administration. This speaks to presidential disability and how a vice president with a majority of the cabinet or a committee as constructed by Congress can declare the president unfit to serve office or unable to serve office. And then the vice president would take over as president. And then there's a provision for the president to go back to Congress and to reclaim the powers of the presidency. Again, there was discussion at the very end of the Trump administration after January 6th about invoking the 25th Amendment in order to make Vice President Pence as president. That didn't go anywhere, but that was a discussion that was being had. 26th Amendment gave the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then the final 27th Amendment is a really interesting one. This 27th Amendment was written by none other than James Madison and was ratified in 1992. Madison wrote this amendment to be part of the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights originally was supposed to be 11 amendments rather than 10 amendments. This amendment, written by Madison, says that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. In other words, Congress cannot raise its salary and raise its compensation until it has already run for re-election. You have to have an intervening election. So if Congress says we want to raise our salary, they can't take advantage of that until they stand for re-election. Madison proposed this way back in the late 1700s, and it didn't get enough state legislatures to ratify it to become part of the Constitution. So it lay dormant for almost 200 years. A student found it, a student in Texas, I believe, found it and wrote a paper on how it was still a viable amendment. You'll notice in these amendments, most modern amendments have a provision that says that if they are not ratified within 7 years, they go out of existence. That there is a sunset provision that an amendment, once it's proposed, needs to be ratified within 7 years before, or else it just becomes dormant. This one didn't have that because Madison wrote it way back in the 1700s. So he argued since it didn't have a sunset provision, it was still a viable amendment and could still be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. Wrote the paper on it. I think he got a C or a C- from his professor. Professors don't know what they're doing sometimes. Went ahead and started a nationwide movement to get this ratified, got enough state legislatures to ratify it for it to become the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. Again, 200 years after it was originally proposed by James Madison. And so 1992, May 7th, 1992 is the last time that we have amended the federal Constitution. So we don't amend the federal Constitution very often. Now, in addition to the federal Constitution, as public administrators here in the state of California, we also have to be mindful of the state of California Constitution. So we're not going to go through the state of California Constitution because, again, that's 2 or 3 classes in and of itself. But just to give you some parallels between the California Constitution and the federal Constitution. Yeah, the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was proposed, didn't get the 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify it within its 7 years. And so that's why it then became dormant and to become part of the Constitution. There has been a movement, though, to get more state legislatures to ratify it, to try and get it as an amendment to the Constitution. So we'll see how that plays out, but it didn't get enough state legislatures to ratify it to become part of the Constitution. But in California, we have a Constitution that is not only longer than the federal Constitution, it is longer than any other state constitution and is one of the longest constitutions in the entire world. Here in California, our state constitution has 35 articles as opposed to 7 in the federal Constitution. We have 35 articles. It consists of hundreds of sections, and our state constitution has been amended over 500 times. So think about that. Federal Constitution has been amended 27 times. The California Constitution has been amended over 500 times. My question for you is why? Why so many amendments to the state of California Constitution? Why the difference?
Ballot initiatives.
Exactly, the initiative process. Here in California, we have an initiative and a referendum process. We talked about that last week. So we have a lot of additional vehicles. It's much easier to amend the Constitution here in California than it is to amend the federal Constitution. Now, in our Constitution, we have a bicameral legislature, which is, again, similar to what we see at the federal level, much smaller than what we see at the federal level. In our California State Assembly, we have 80 seats in the State Assembly, a supermajority Democrats currently. We have 40 seats in the California State Senate, again, a supermajority Democrat there as well. And so we really do have, and we have a Democratic governor, so you really have very much one-party control here in the state of California. The California Constitution is very, very detailed, and every article is organized around a different topic. So there's an elections article, there's a local government article, there's an education article, there's a health article. And so every major topic, every major policy area, there is a separate article for it. The way in which we amend the California Constitution is different than the federal Constitution. The federal Constitution, we append the amendments to the end of the Constitution. So here's your Constitution, and then here are your 27 amendments. Here in California, when we amend the Constitution, we don't append the amendments to the Constitution. we go in and we change the language within the Constitution itself. So if it's an amendment that will amend Article 32, we then go in and we amend the language within Article 32. So don't expect to see the California Constitution and then 500 amendments added at the end. We change the language along the way as we adopt those amendments to the Constitution. It's not a bad idea when you have time, for whatever topic area you're interested in, to go and see what the California Constitution has to say about that topic. But again, it's a very lengthy Constitution and well beyond the scope of what we're able to do in this class to discuss it. I know we're really, really long. It's already 6:15, but instead of taking a break, I'll let you out early tonight, but let me cover one piece of information that you need to have for your Canvas essay number 2. My original vision tonight was the second half of class tonight, we would talk about accountability and ethics. Obviously, we're not going to have time to do that, but what I do want to do is I do want to show you the ASPA Code of Ethics, because for Canvas essay number 2, you are going to be selecting 3 of the 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct and discussing which 3 you think would be difficult for you or for your organization. So I wanted to just go through these quickly just so you'll be prepared to do Canvas essay number 2. And then when we begin class next week, we will go through accountability and ethics and then talk about our public versus private sector distinctions. But just for now, just so we can do Canvas essay number 2, the American Society for Public Administration has produced for us a code of conduct. You can see there's a preamble there telling you about the American Society for Public Administration advances the science, art, and practice of public administration. The society affirms its responsibility to develop a spirit of responsible professionalism within its membership and to increase awareness and commitment to ethical principles and standards among all those who work in public service in all sectors. To this end, we, the members of the society, commit ourselves to uphold the following principles. Now, as public administrators, we are, number one, administrators, but we are also oftentimes members of other professional organizations. So if you're a budget analyst, you're a public administrator, but you are also probably a member of a budget professionals organization. If you're an engineer, you are a public administrator, but you're also a professional engineer. So you have your professional engineering society code of conduct. But the one code of conduct that is common to all of us, regardless of our job, regardless of our profession, is this ASPA Code of Ethics. So it consists of 8 different principles. Principle number 1 is to advance the public interest, promote the interests of the public, and put service to the public above service to oneself. Obviously, it's important for us in the public sector that we are serving the public, and public interest is more important than our private interest. Number 2, uphold the Constitution and the law. This is the reason why we spent tonight talking about the Constitution. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. Principle 3, promote democratic participation. This is something that Jay had mentioned earlier. Inform the public, encourage active engagement in governance. Be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealings with public organizations. Number 4, strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. Principle 5, fully inform and advise. Provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members, and to staff members in your organization. One of the issues we run into in public administration is that as administrators in agencies, we have a lot of the details about how policies and programs are being implemented, but we are being overseen by legislative officials, by members of Congress, or by state legislatures or city councils. It's incumbent upon us to provide the information that those overseers need in order to properly conduct their oversight of our agencies. So we need to fully inform and advise. Number 6, demonstrate personal integrity. Adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in public service. 7, promote ethical organizations. Strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. And number 8, advance professional excellence. Strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. So those are the 8 principles of the ASPA Code of Conduct. I wanted to go through these with you tonight because, again, for your Canvas essay number 2, based on these 8 principles, I want you to select 3, at least 3 of them, that you think might be difficult either for you to implement or difficult for your organization to implement, and tell me why those might be difficult for you or for your organization. So just covering them here, they sound pretty basic and pretty straightforward, but pull out that fully inform and advise again. Sometimes it's not in our best interest as an agency in terms of future appropriations to provide all the information that our overseers will need in order to conduct proper oversight. There's something that's known as the principal-agent relationship. And in the principal-agent relationship, our overseers are the principals, and we as agencies, we are the agents. And the agents actually have more information than the principals. And so sometimes there's a moral hazard that we might be tempted not to provide this information because it would create more headaches for us, because it would make it easier for Congress or for state legislatures to oversee our actions. But we do need to fully inform and advise to make sure that we are adding to public value and that we are meeting the needs of our citizenry. But again, I just wanted to present this to you. These are the 8 principles. Select 3 of them and discuss which 3 you think would be difficult for either you or your organization to implement as Canvas essay number 3. And I'm sorry, I missed Tracy's comment from a long time ago in text chat, and I apologize, Tracy, for missing it. Going back to federalism, it's safe to assume our government today runs both inclusive and contextual federalism concurrently. Yeah, there's not just one approach. And so I think depends on the issue. In some issues, the approach is much more inclusive with a lot of power from the national government over state and local governments. Sometimes it's a little bit more overlapping in nature. The only model that really doesn't apply all that much anymore is the coordinated authority model. That's a much rarer approach to federalism today than it used to be back in the 17 and early 1800s. Again, I'm sorry we went very long tonight, but there was a whole lot of information to cover. I know that I owe you time from last week where we ran over, and I also didn't give you a break tonight. So rather than going into the discussion of ethics, let's just cut it here for the evening. I have a link provided for you in our week 3 module directly to this ASPA Code of Conduct. So you have a ready place to go and reread these 8 principles. So that'll be for Canvas essay number 3. Then when we come back next week, we'll start the class with our discussion of accountability and ethics. We'll go through all the slides. Let me go back to. We'll talk about what is accountability. We'll talk about different approaches to accountability. We'll talk about what we hold people accountable for. We'll talk about why it's so difficult to hold people accountable in the public sector. We'll talk about the differences in accountability and ethical standards between the public and the private sector. I'll read to you from an excerpt from one of my favorite books, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, and give you an example of how ethical standards are different today than perhaps they were back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. We'll do all that in the first half of class. Then I promise you I'll give you a break next week. And then the second half of class, we'll look at differences between public and private sectors and provide a justification for why we study public administration differently than we study private administration. Okay? I know a lot of information for tonight, but I thought it was important that we did cover the Constitution, because I don't know if you'll ever have another opportunity in grad school to cover the Constitution, and it is so elemental to what we do in social contract theory. So are there any other questions or any observations or comments at all about any of the information on the Constitution or information on our foundations of American government? Anything at all? Okay. If not, I'll go ahead and I'll have the recording up there by tomorrow morning. So if you need to go back and review anything, you can certainly do that tomorrow. And then next week, we'll be back at it again and moving onward and upward. Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.